7,500 seats. That is the capacity of the stadium court at the William H.G. Fitzgerald Tennis Center in Washington, D.C., the outdoor hardcourt venue built inside Rock Creek Park, one of the oldest federal recreation areas in the United States. Public park. Free to enter. Open to anyone. $7,500 seats surrounding a tennis court. And according to reports coming out of the DC Open this week, those seats were gone. Filled, taken, claimed, before AlexEala had hit a single ball in the draw.
Over the last month, at least 80%, if not more, of requests in this tournament are about AlexEala.
The number that circulated through tennis social media wasn't a ranking update or a prize money figure. It was simpler than that. It was a sold-out sign, and attached to it everywhere you looked was one name. This is the story of what happens when a sport that spent a century building walls discovers that someone has already filled the room inside. Washington, D.C. sits at the intersection of a lot of American stories. Political, cultural, historical.
I would have loved to see more of the city, but the matches are very demanding, the training is demanding, and this is the first priority.
What it is less famous for, at least in the summer, is tennis. The DC Open has existed in various forms for decades, but the women's draw wasn't elevated to full WTA 500 status until 2023, which means this is still a young event in the women's game, still finding its identity. It hasn't yet accumulated the mythology of a Stanford or a Cincinnati. It's a tournament in formation. Into that formation stepped AlexEala, 21 years old, born in Manila, ranked somewhere in the upper tier of the WTA this summer based on a trajectory that has been, for those following closely, almost impossible to look away from. And what arrived with her, not as a PR campaign, not as a marketing strategy, but as an organic, self-organized force, was a community. The Filipino-American population in the D.C., Maryland, and Virginia corridor is not a footnote. Census data and community organizations put the number at over 100,000 people in the broader metropolitan area, one of the largest, most established, and most civically active Filipino-American communities in the United States. They had been here long before AlexEala entered a tennis draw. But this week, they had somewhere specific to be. The WTA is not an institution that has ignored global diversity. It has public programs aimed at growing the sport in underrepresented markets. It has actively worked to expand its Asian footprint, particularly since the return of Chinese players to the tour after a painful absence. Tournament directors talk regularly about broadening the sport's demographic appeal. There are genuine, documented efforts in this direction. That is the honest starting point. And yet, the sold-out report from Washington, if reports hold, was not the result of a WTA marketing campaign. There is no evidence that the DC Open's promotional materials featured AlexEala as a primary draw. There is no evidence of institutional coordination with Filipino-American community organizations to drive ticket sales. What the reports describe instead is something more interesting and, depending on how you read it, more pointed. A community that organized itself, that logged on to a ticketing platform, pooled its resources, made group transportation plans, and showed up before anyone in a boardroom decided they mattered enough to court. That gap between what the institution promotes and what an organic fanbase builds is not an accusation. It is an observation, and it is the most honest framing of what Eala Mania in Washington actually means. The WTA has seen what player-driven cultural moments can do. It has lived through them and, in retrospect, celebrated them. But in the moment, when they arrive ahead of institutional anticipation, they look less like a marketing victory and more like a correction. The crowd is telling the sport something. The question is whether the sport is listening. Over 100,000 Filipino Americans in the DMV corridor. That number has civic weight. These are communities with established churches, cultural organizations, professional networks, and political representation. When reports from multiple Philippine sports outlets described Facebook groups and group chats organizing ticket purchases in the days after the DC Open draw was released, it was not surprising to anyone who has watched how this community mobilizes. It was, in a sense, the predictable result of years of waiting for exactly this kind of moment. A draw release, a name in it, ticket link. The organization that followed was reportedly meticulous. P3 sentiment. Hedge required group buys. Carpools from Maryland and Virginia suburbs. Families making a weekend of it. And alongside the logistics, the cultural markers. Flags, jerseys, handmade banners in Filipino text, food from home packed into coolers that would wait outside the gates. The kind of preparation that doesn't happen for a casual outing. The kind that happens when something feels, finally, unmissable. What this crowd built without institutional help was an atmosphere. And that atmosphere is the first piece of evidence in this story's argument. Rock Creek Park is federal land. It is managed by the National Park Service. It belongs, in the most literal legal sense, to the American public, to every citizen and every visitor, regardless of income, regardless of me. The Fitzgerald Tennis Center that sits inside it has hosted tennis for decades, but the sport that fills it carries a very different historical reputation. Tennis has long been the sport of the private club, the membership fee, the introduction-only world. It is a sport that has had to be argued into public spaces. The irony of what happened this week is architectural. The sport built on exclusion sold out a public park, and the people who filled it were a community the sport's traditional establishment never designed its marketing around. They bought those tickets anyway. They filled that park anyway. The setting makes the argument without needing to say a word. This is not a small detail. It is, in the context of a story about cultural symbolism, the whole story compressed into a postcard image. A Philippine flag rising in Rock Creek Park, Washington, D.C., in August, surrounded by 7,500 people who came because a 21-year-old from Manila gave them a reason. Tennis has seen this before. That is worth saying clearly, because it prevents the narrative from becoming mythology when history serves the argument just as well. In 2011, Li Na won the French Open, the first player from China, from any country in East Asia, to win a Grand Slam singles title. What followed was documented and dramatic. Broadcast rights in China spiked. Sponsorship deals restructured. The WTA found itself with a new market it had not fully cultivated, delivered to them by one woman's victory. The sport adapted. It built events in China. It courted Chinese sponsors. It became, in a measurable commercial sense, different because of what Li Na represented. That precedent matters here. Not because AlexEala is Li Na, they are different players, different nations, different moments, but because the structural pattern is the same. A player arrives from outside the sport's traditional geography. She is good enough to compete at the highest level. And she brings with her a community that was never part of the sport's audience. Not because they didn't love the game, but because the game had never given them a reason to feel specifically seen. Li Na gave China that reason. The WTA benefited enormously. The question now, in Washington in August 2026, is whether the sport recognizes the pattern it's living through, and whether it responds with the same speed it wishes it had shown in 2011. And then there are the flags. At multiple North American tournaments across 2025, video documentation confirmed what Filipino fans had already been doing for years, bringing the tricolor into the stands. AlexEala walked into a draw. Community walked into a stadium. And somewhere in the stands of Rock Creek Park, in the middle of the American capital, a flag went up. Not as a celebration of what has already been won, as a statement of what is coming. If you're watching this channel, you already know what that flag means. You've known for a while. The rest of the tennis world is catching up. We'll be here when they do.